So for me, sort of the impact has been to feed into those conversations. It's to begin to bring a little bit of a reality check to this sort of European ambition. We want to access minerals, but also promote development, an African ambition, industrialization, but say, yeah, okay, but these things need to land somewhere, and there's a lot of things that need to align for this to actually lead to some kind of impact. ECDPM looks at Europe-Africa relations through a number of different lenses, but one of those is especially economic, and not necessarily to do with aid, but to do with economic interdependencies. And I think value chains basically offer a very interesting way of looking at this interdependency, where Europe looks for markets, but it also looks for inputs into its own production, and Africa as well is looking for inputs, but also markets for its production too. So in a way, we have this sort of interdependency between the two, trying to access inputs on the European side for their green transition, and on the African side looking for investment and ways to increase their value addition for industrialization and jobs and ultimately for development. Also, we were using value chains, but looking at it starting from a green industrialization perspective, saying that even if the green ambitions are perhaps less priority for certain African countries, where it's just development is really what's needed, the fact that this green transition is becoming a global ambition means that there's an interest in trying to see what are the strategies that certain African countries could be using, which would meet their development needs, but also help meet these green transition ambitions. So what we did was to look at the possibilities of a battery value chain. I think what becomes interesting is that the demand is rising. So in theory, again, on the African side, there's a demand for these batteries. There's more and more need for small-scale mobility, sort of scooters and batteries for scooters. Therefore, in theory, there is this market for investment into batteries using the minerals which are there. But the question is sort of who has the capabilities to do it? And I think at the moment, one of the risks is, and this brings us back to the European question, is that on the European side, there's an interest in trying to disengage from or reduce dependency on China. But in fact, the Europeans don't necessarily have the capability to build batteries either. So in fact, there's a bunch of ambitions linked to this battery value chain, meeting the demand, whether it's in Africa or globally, but a lot of challenges that actually which are both the technical level in terms of the investments needed and the kind of processing required, and at the political level in terms of what policies need to be in place and what interests and ambitions can play out. And for me, this is all part of a process. So I think of it as being partly about understanding these EU-Africa relations. And I think by putting these issues on the table, it feeds into European discussions around the CRMs Act and what that means in terms of practice. And it's not just about the EU signing CRM partnerships with different countries and immediately getting access to different goods, that it forces a bit the conversation to take account of these competing interests on the ground. And I think on the African side, what's been interesting is that it's allowed us also to feed into some of the discussions, not so much on the African mining vision, which is very focused on minerals, but into the continental free trade area, where there is this big ambition about promoting regional value chains, where the auto sector, for example, is one of the big priorities. And there's a real sort of question about what is it going to take to use the AFCFTA to lead to these regional value chains and thus industrialization. Three different things come to mind in terms of future elements. One, I think the market on e-mobility is going to be growing. So I think there's an interest actually to see where this thinking about the battery value chain could link even more into specific private sector initiatives. Another aspect is just value chain approaches in general. So in fact, we're also looking at other value chains and what it takes to promote a regional value chain, for example, in the textile sector. And a third element, I think, which is important, is that part of the challenge of creating these value chains links back to issues around trade and trade facilitation. How do you move pieces and parts and components across borders? And I think one of the big challenges within Africa, where the AFCFTA seeks to be an answer, is facilitating this trade. And I think part of what we want to look at now is also to see what are the processes that need to be put in place in order to facilitate trade, whether it's for value chains such as the batteries or for textiles or indeed for other sectors.